Lester, Wushu Engineer. I'm going to get straight into this video today because, without much of a preamble, because this project grew and grew and actually became something that had more moving parts than I actually expected it to. I almost feel like I need to apologize for this video because it's going to be too long, needlessly detailed, and the subject matter is actually so niche that I would bust a gut trying to find a target audience for it. But yet, here we are, and I'm completely unapologetically committed to presenting this project inspired by a Warhammer 40K Dark Heresy campaign in which I am playing a Moritat death cult assassin. So, to give you a little bit more background on that, I've been playing two Dark Heresy role-playing campaigns recently. One is being run on Discord, and the other is a standard conventional tabletop campaign. For those who may not know, Dark Heresy is a role-playing game system that's set within the Warhammer 40K universe, where you all start out as low-level Inquisition agents, sent to investigate various mysteries and root out chaos, heresy, and Xenos threats wherever you find them. I've played a couple of tabletop Warhammer 40K war games quite a long time ago, I must admit. I actually played using the old Warhammer 40K Epic boxed sets. The one with the Imperial Titans and Knights, and I think there's some Orcs in it as well. But the wargaming side is actually not really my bag. It's a bit too expensive for my liking, and I prefer to concentrate my tactics and strategies on single player characters, rather than dispersing that over a large group of units. However, tabletop role-playing is definitely my thing, and I've been actively role-playing since the late 1980s. I've also been following the evolving Warhammer 40K setting since the late 1990s, when I discovered my first White Dwarf magazine in a pile of publications bought from a bulk magazine shop in South Africa. The Warhammer 40K lore and setting is a fascinating deep dive that steals many hours of your time, but I've always really loved the aesthetic and the lore of the Warhammer 40K universe. In terms of role-playing games, my favorite aspects of tabletop role-playing games include the storytelling aspect, the social aspect, and the opportunity to experiment with tactics and strategies while interacting with the world mechanics within various time frames, whether that's the short time frame of a single round of combat, or within long duration plans, schemes, and politics of a full campaign arc. As such, I usually play characters that, while often being from what would be classed as the support player classes, typically have high levels of combat competence and are also able to become strategically important within a story. So it shouldn't be any surprise that the character that I'm playing in the Discord campaign is a tech priest named Natalis, while the character I'm playing in the tabletop game is a Moritat Assassin named Ka. Both are still first level characters, so they suck a little bit. They're not too epically powerful yet. However, both are still extremely cool characters to play. Now, in this case, for this video, it's the backstory of my assassin named Ka, along with his gear, that inspired me to build this weapon and make this video. So, Ka comes from a what's classed as a feral world named Strank. While Strank is not classified as a death world as such, it's a borderline case, because habitable areas are covered mostly by giant swamps that spawn all manner of deadly and toxic fauna and flora. The most notable creature that spawned in the swamps of Strank, the most notable creatures are giant 30-meter plus long venomous snakes, which the primal inhabitants occasionally hunt for food and other commodities. As such, it's a very similar environment to the world of Catachan, which led to the formation of the tough Astra Militarum fighting units known as the Catachan Jungle Fighters. Most Warhammer 40k fans know about them. The world of Strank, although less well known than Catachan, has given rise to an equally effective fighting unit known as the Strank Swamp Stalkers. As the name suggests, these units operate most efficiently when deployed in dense jungle or swampland. In fact, the makeup of a Swamp Stalker regiment is actually loosely based on the same primitive hunting teams that would hunt the denizens of the Strank swamps using bows, arrows, spears, and blades. In fact, typical Swamp Stalker units are a bit of an exception within the Astra Militarum because many of the members in a particular unit will either be blood related or from the same primitive tribe. It was found that making up units that already had an established hierarchical structure and that were already tried and tested as a hunting unit carried over as a far more efficient and enhanced military unit. Because that's what the Swamp Stalkers are. They're actually hunters. Now, whether their prey is a giant snake to feed the tribe for a few days, or whether their prey is an entrenched chaos cultist camp, doesn't make any difference to them. They will hunt both with the same quiet, ruthless, dogged persistence and deadly efficiency. Swamp Stalkers typically rely heavily on quiet concealment and ambush tactics to hunt their prey. Much like the Catachan jungle fighters, they're very good at asymmetric warfare and don't bat an eyelid at most monstrous creatures because, well, yesterday me nan beat a 10-meter long snake to death with a walking stick. You know, what we always say, nan's gotta eat. However, unlike the Catachan jungle fighters, they don't foster the same kind of gung-ho attitude. They are a lot quieter, they're more introspective, somewhat fatalistic. They often still adhere to forms of primitive superstition, such as believing that the day and hour of their death or the means of their death can be foretold by the Strank tribal shamans at birth. Their gear selection reflects this lack of bravado and emphasis on ruthless efficiency in the hunt. With each Strank Swamp Stalker outfitted with a camellia-lined cloak, which is a cloak offering active camouflage. And yes, I am really interested in developing my own take on adaptive camouflage cloak to mimic the effects of a camellia-lined cloak. I'm still thinking about that project though. Perhaps you'll see that on my channel someday if I can come up with a novel, interesting, clever way of making a camellia-lined cloak equivalent in real life. Now, most Swamp Stalkers prefer to be armed with shorter range shotguns, automatic stubbers, or las carbines, rather than long range firepower because most of their fighting is at close range due to swamp growth and broken terrain. They excel at ambushes and traps, working in hunting teams as they would on their native world to bring down their prey, which often includes the monstrous snakes that spawn in the deep swamp. They are also highly valued for their wilderness survival skills, tracking, and general strength and toughness. As such, a Swamp Stalker unit is typically classed as a recon unit. It's also said that they can survive poisonous gases that will instantly kill the average guardsman due to resistance built up towards the natural toxicity of the swamp. They also occasionally make good use of poison themselves, harvested from the venomous creatures of their homeworld, on their blades and poison gas grenades, rather than using simple frags or cracks. In addition to the camellia-lined camouflage cloaks, typical Swamp Stalkers are also equipped with light flak vests. light flak coats, not the vests. For those that are equipped with las weapons, they will have las carbines with sights and a long las with a sight for the designated sniper. However, many of the Swamp Stalkers favor solid projectile weapons over las weapons because, coming from a feral world, they have a lot more experience with solid projectile weapons rather than the more technologically advanced las weapons. Solid projectile equipped squads will have combat shotguns, auto guns with sights, and a Nomad sniper rifle with sight for the designated sniper. Now the Nomad is roughly equivalent to the real world Barrett M82s, anti-material and also long range heavy sniper rifle. Because many of the Swamp Stalkers favor combat shotguns due to their inherent stopping power at shorter range, in addition to their versatility in terms of ammo, Swamp Stalkers often carry a wide array of shotgun shell types. These include conventional buckshot and solid slugs, but can also include armor-piercing, inferno shells, which explode in a small charge of high-intensity burning plasma, high-explosive shells, high-explosive anti-tank shells, armor-piercing discarding sabot shells, armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot shells, and also flechette shells. In terms of grenades, Swamp Stalkers are typically armed with frag grenades, poison gas grenades, and nail grenades, which is kind of unique to the Swamp Stalkers in that they shoot little poison darts in all directions instead of basic shrapnel. Now, huge numbers of the indigenous hunters of Strank apply for acceptance into the Astra Militarum Swamp Stalkers because of the amazing opportunity it presents to improve the lives of their families and tribes through the financial benefits that members of the Astra Militarum receive. Many Swamp Stalkers send most of their income back to their families and tribes on Strank, which on a feral world can equate to a great deal of wealth and prosperity. As such, competition for acceptance into the Swamp Stalkers is extremely high, and only the very best of the best get accepted into the final selection process known as simply as the Hunt, which is essentially a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek in the swamp. The Hunt is held at regular intervals through the year at many separate locations on Strank, producing a quota of perhaps 100,000 Swamp Stalkers per year. This may seem like a large quota, but it's dwarfed by the 50 to 100 million candidates who attempt the selection tests but are rejected every year. In fact, many potential candidates die or are permanently injured during the grueling pre-selection tests set in the toxic miasma of the deep swamps. Only the very best prospective stalkers make it to the final selection of the Hunt. These lucky few, typically numbering only about 100 at a time for any particular hunt, are released into the swamp where they have to quickly make their own ghillie suits out of any materials they can find at hand. After a predetermined period of time, fully fledged stalkers hunt the prospects down with low power las carbines. These las carbine weapons have their settings throttled to the point where prospects are seldom killed by the low power blasts. Now, the last 20 applicants of the 100 to be found and eliminated are chosen to join the regiment. My character Carr attempted the hunt as a Swamp Stalker prospect. However, during the hunt, he ended up killing one of the stalkers sent to hunt him before he was finally overwhelmed by concentrated fire. Instead of using his time to make himself a ghillie suit, like most applicants, he grabbed some heavy stones, placed them on his chest, and immersed himself directly into the mud and stagnant swamp water in one of the reed beds, using the weight of the stones to keep his body down. Now, after half an hour or so, the silt, mud, reeds, and water had settled to the point where he was invisible, but for the tips of his lips that just broke the surface of the swamp within a clump of reeds. Lying quietly under the water, feeling the tingling of the toxic mud and water on his skin, with biting brine shrimp and blood leeches crawling and feeding on him constantly, he could just barely perceive the distant cracks of lasfire through the water as the other applicants were quickly eliminated. After a couple of hours, the lasfire died to nothing, signaling that he was perhaps one of the last remaining candidates. And that would have been a great time for him to have risen out of the mud and been accepted into the ranks of the Swamp Stalkers. But what he didn't anticipate was that, despite the fact that he had been careful to conceal his tracks, one of the Stalkers had eventually managed to find his covered tracks and was right then bearing down on his location. The Stalker did not see Carr concealed as he was, but he followed the faint signs of human movement until Carr could literally feel his imminent approach through the small shifts in the mud and the water. It was then that Carr's extreme life experiences and pent-up fury and survival instinct kicked in, bringing on a raging psychotic episode, turning the game for Carr into a life or death event. At that moment, Carr took one extreme, long, slow in-breath through his lips, filling his lungs to capacity. He then lashed out and grabbed the Stalker's legs before rolling and twisting with the man into the deep waters of the swamp. As soon as he was underwater with the Stalker, he adjusted his hold into a bear hug to compress the man's diaphragm and chest, forcing all of the air out of the Stalker's lungs and then holding him under until he stopped moving. It was then, once the rage had passed, that Carr realized that his life was forfeit. He grabbed the Stalker's las carbine and quickly crawled out of the mire to head into the deep swamp in a last-ditch attempt to survive. But the splashing and struggle had alerted the rest of the Swamp Stalkers, who quickly converged on Carr and brought him down in a hail of low-power las gun fire. Ordinarily, this action of Carr's would be grounds for immediate on-the-spot execution, but the Moritat death cult often have representatives present at the Strank Swamp Stalker hunts. It was at the point where Carr, who had been dragged back to camp badly burnt by lasfire and unconscious and about to be summarily executed for murdering a Swamp Stalker, that a very shady-looking hooded person tapped the shoulder of the testing officer and said, "We will take that one." As it turned out, Carr was the very last remaining candidate, and if he had not killed the Swamp Stalker who hunted him, he would have been gratefully accepted and received into the ranks of the Astra Militarum Swamp Stalkers. However, fate played a different hand, and Carr began his journey into the shadowy world of the Moritat Assassins. Now, I mentioned the Strassid earlier, which is the go-to melee sidearm for the Swamp Stalker units. It's a signature weapon, much like the real-world Gurkha Kukri and the in-universe Katachan combat knife. Of course, this video is detailing my modding of a cold steel machete into one of these signature Swamp Stalker Strassid weapons. So I need to go into a bit more detail on this in-universe weapon as well. I based the original design of the Strassid on the established cold steel Magnum Kukri machete design for a few reasons. The primary reason being that I already had one that I could modify. This happens to be a second one that we had. Nonetheless, it's also quite an efficient cutter, and it would be relatively easy to stamp these designs out on a steel mill and mass produce them even on a feral world. Additionally, it looks the part with a strong Warhammer 40K aesthetic and very much looks like something that you would expect to find originating from a feral world, in particular a swamp world. The Strassid is a weapon which is typically carried by most of the indigenous population of Strank. And the word Strassid can be roughly translated as swamp surgeon or swamp doctor, because the Strassid's heavy cutting blade has often been used to amputate gangrenous limbs in the deep swamps. The Strassid functions mostly as a tool on Strank, being used to cut through dense undergrowth, as you'd expect, chop wood for fires, skin animals, a whole list of other utilitarian tasks. It also functions as a close-range weapon because much of Strank's fauna and flora are ambush predators, which dictates some very close-range self-defense solutions. As such, Strassids are really simply glorified and modified machetes. The blades are typically thinner than conventional swords to make them more effective as tools and at cutting through vegetation and the like. However, the very wide, the relatively wide blade actually compensates for any loss of blade stiffness due to blade thickness, making Strassids still quite useful as sword equivalents. On Strank, Strassids come in many regional varieties and sizes. Many Strassid variants incorporate simplified handguards because they are often employed as dueling weapons on Strank to settle disputes between tribes or between members of tribes. However, the Strassids carried by the Astra Militarum Swamp Stalker units are most often cut-down versions with blades this kind of length for ease of carry. Almost always incorporate a simple handguard like the modified Strassid that I built for this video. Depending on the wealth and status of the individual swamp stalker, they may have lavished quite a lot of attention on their Strassid. Some Strassids have been upgraded to be mono-edged weapons, and many incorporate some kind of offhand shield in the sheath to enable sword and board combat options. There are even whispers of some Strassids that have been upgraded to be power weapons. Off-world, the Strassid has earned the nickname of the Strank Bifurcator because the larger, higher-end mono variants have been known to be able to chop a human aggressor cleanly in half. Of course, being a Moritat Assassin, my player car wields a signature mono Strassid, although it is a much longer variant than the typical cut-down Strassid like this one, carried by a swamp stalker. Okay, so I wanted to build a Strassid, and one of the goals was to make it look as though it was a Warhammer 40k weapon. But for me, for those who know me from my channel, from my videos, looks are not enough. I need functionality. I wanted to build a mono short sword variant of the Strassid. So this is the technologically upgraded mono version of a Strassid that would be the backup melee weapon of a Swamp Stalker unit commander, an officer's weapon. The Warhammer 40k wiki describes the monomolecular edge of an Astartes combat knife as holding a monomolecular edge that never dulls, even through centuries of service. The concept of having a blade that's only a single molecule thick is a staple of science fiction. However, in reality, the functionality of a blade like this is questionable. A good video to watch regarding this is the video entitled "The Sharpest Object in the World Can't Cut Anything," which is on the SciShow channel. I'd recommend that you watch that for a bit of background if you're interested. But to put it simply, the sharpness of the blade edge is just one small part of what makes a blade cut easily through various materials. Other factors include, but are not limited to, the strength of the intermolecular forces, within the target material, the mechanical properties of the blade, the kinetic energy of the strike, the technique and biomechanics of the blade wielder, the hardness of the edge and its resistance to dulling, the thickness of the blade, because the blade has to essentially push the material to either side as it pushes through, and the thicker the blade, the more resistance this is going to present to the blade, and also the frictional forces between the blade and the target material as it passes through. So edge sharpness is not the be-all and end-all that it's made out to be in science fiction. The in-universe law reason for the performance of a mono-edged weapon does not account for the actual description of this kind of blade's performance. So I would say that the edge treatment is actually only one aspect of these mono weapons. Perhaps that's the only aspect that's mentioned in the law, but the actual performance would probably actually require the use of special in-universe lubricant treatments, changes to the edge geometry, changes to the blade composition, and would probably still require some kind of specialized maintenance regime. But it's far easier to limit the description in-game to, it's just very sharp, governor. So to try to mimic a mono-edged weapon in real life, I wanted to do something special with the edge. And the closest treatment that I could find that approaches the performance of a monomolecular edge is what is referred to in knife-making circles as a carbidized edge treatment. Carbidization essentially involves micro-welding a very, very thin layer of tungsten carbide to one side of the knife edge. This creates essentially like a ledge of very hard tungsten carbide that forms the very sharp edge of the weapon. Now ideally, if I had things my way, I would have wanted a flat, uniform, thin edge of tungsten carbide applied to this blade. But I don't have access to the kind of vapor deposition equipment that would be necessary to achieve this kind of treatment. So I had to instead settle for standard carbidization, which leaves a very uneven ledge of bumpy tungsten carbide sort of blobs, not blobs really, little puddles along the edge. It kind of looks a bit like this when it is magnified. I took a little video clip of it using my son's digital microscope. However, there is an additional benefit of having that sort of rough tungsten carbide edge. Because the edge becomes what is referred to as micro-serrated. It cuts a little bit like a serrated knife, with draw cuts becoming more effective. So I think I can demonstrate that. I hope I can demonstrate that here using some old carbonated beverage cans. Now I'm not endorsing Coca-Cola. I'm not sponsored by them, and at best I am ambivalent to its consumption. So this is not an advert. But anyway, so we'll give this a go. Okay. Just being a little careful with my fingers there, but there you go. So essentially being able to saw through this can using a draw cut. If I were to take the untreated blade and try and do the same, you can kind of get it working, but it doesn't work in exactly the same way. Okay, it's you can cut through it, but it doesn't cut like a serrated knife. So just a bit of an interesting demo there. Okay, this is unfortunately the second time I'm trying to film this. I hope this comes through all right. I hope this blimmin' thing works. Anyway, First of all, I'm just going to put on some highly protective gloves, as you can see, just to protect my hands notionally. Now, this is the Strassid weapon. This is a piece of reasonably high carbon steel. This is actually an old part of an old saw blade, as you can tell. So I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to show this to you. I'm going to go for a bit of a rusty part of the blade here, and I'm going to see whether I can shave parts of it off. So hopefully you can sort of see the little shavings, the metal shavings. I'm shaving off the edge of this piece of reasonably high carbon steel. So that's one of the interesting aspects of having a blade edge that is this hard. It's been treated with tungsten carbide, micro welded along the edge, otherwise called carbidized in the knife making industry. So there you go. Hopefully you can see the little pieces that I've shaved off this reasonably high carbon steel. I just thought it would be an interesting demo. You can maybe even see on this piece of paper little black spots. These are bits of the steel that I've shaved off. Yeah, just very interesting. Now, another benefit of the carbidized edge is that as the knife is used, the softer steel on the untreated side of the edge is actually eroded. Very much like a rodent's teeth, actually. Rodents, their teeth keep growing and the underside keeps getting eroded, but the hard enamel on the front remains, keeping them sharp. There's a similar kind of thing here, where the steel is eroded on the untreated edge, while the tungsten ledge remains sort of sticking out. So this actually leads to the blade being sharpened through use. And actually, when you read the wiki on mono-edged weapons, this is precisely the kind of quality that is described when it's stated that they never need sharpening. So theoretically, you could actually get really good performance out of this consistently without sharpening it. Practically though, it's better to sharpen and hone the blade to make sure that the edge remains uniformly sharp. So while it was not ideal, the idea of a micro-serrated carbidized blade is about as universe appropriate as you can get in Warhammer 40K, with all the chain swords and chain axes and such flying around the place. It's the closest thing that I could practically build to what would be considered a monomolecular edge. So as I implied earlier when I was talking about cutting effectiveness, one of the problems with the conventional science fiction notion of a monomolecular blade is that the sharpness of the edge of the weapon itself is not the only limiting factor to its cutting effectiveness. As I've discussed on several of my older videos in the past, the frictional forces acting on the sides of the weapon as the weapon moves through a target act to limit the weapon's cutting efficiency. Essentially, when you swing a weapon, it essentially becomes a bit like an energy capacitor. In this case, it'll be kinetic energy capacitor. While the skill of the user does allow some modification of striking characteristics at the point of impact, that weapon must still act as a bit of a capacitor, storing kinetic energy, which is then released when it strikes an object and cuts through it. So in that kind of scenario, I would actually go so far as to say that the frictional forces between the blade as it moves through the target, perhaps even more of a limiting factor than the sharpness of the edge. If you can picture maybe a ridiculously wide and thick and rough blade with a very fine edge, for instance, it would cut really well as it made contact with the target, but would decelerate rapidly and lose energy very quickly as the increasing width of the weapon and the roughness of the sides attempts to push the edges of the cut surface apart, and also makes frictional contact with those cut surfaces. In other words, you will lose that energy stored in that weapon, that kinetic energy, very rapidly as it moves through the material. I have investigated the impact of using, excuse the pun, impact of using lubricants on a weapon's cutting efficiency in some past videos, and I've found that it definitely does make a significant difference. But in those previous videos, I have not done everything I can do in terms of modern low friction coating technology. I kind of limited myself in those videos to simple Teflon coatings. So with this build, I put in a lot more work, research and testing to come up with a better approach to low friction treatment. And what I came up with was a two-stage lubricant treatment. I first removed the black plastic coating that the blade comes with originally, and I polished the steel surfaces on a Scotch-Brite belt. Then I treated the steel with tungsten disulfide dry lubricant treatment. So Lamella tungsten disulfide is a high-tech dry lubricant that finds quite a lot of application in aerospace and military industries. Once treated with tungsten disulfide, I treated the blade with a second stage wet lubricant, which was a mixture of silicon oil and WD-40 hydrocarbon liquid. This combination seemed to provide the best overall lubrication and made quite an obvious and sensible difference to the frictional forces felt along the sides of the blade. So this isn't toucher vision, you won't be able to feel it, but it feels like really, really smooth, slippery. My finger is barely actually making any kind of frictional. It feels like it feels like ice a little bit like not quite that smooth, but a bit like ice. So you'll see that every time I put it down, I'm a little bit cautious about it because it's actually so low friction that it occasionally will just slip off the surface that it's placed on. So going on to the hand guard, I designed the hand guard with practicality and versatility in mind. I wanted a hand guard that could be used to augment the weapon usage in some way. Just to readjust my grip here. So that it would also allow for more options in terms of manipulating an opponent's weapon as well. I also needed the hand guard to look aggressive with a strong Warhammer 40K aesthetic. So after quite a few design iterations, I settled on this basic look here. The hand guard has a top hook to prevent weapons from sliding along the top to strike at the wrist. In addition, this hook can actually be used as a thumb hold. So as you can see there, the thumb kind of locks into that hook, which can enable more sort of precise handling of the weapon during some fencing movements. The knuckle guard also has a very aggressive forward-facing spike. Now, in most cases, I don't like spikes and edges on weapons that are located too near to the wielder. It's just, I don't like that. It's just too close for comfort. In this case though, the spike is oriented away from the wielder, and it acts as a momentary locking hook for opponent weapons that slide down to the guard. So if you can imagine the weapon sliding down here and then kind of getting stopped there, allowing this weapon to manipulate it in some way. Okay, so it's a bit of a locking point. In addition, of course, you can use it to punch forward with in a very sort of short range forward punching movement using the guard, perhaps in very close quarters combat. So overall, I'm actually quite happy with the look of the guard. I think it looks very Warhammer 40k, as well as being quite practical. It's made of 2mm thick titanium to give it the look of something that's perhaps stamped out of metal in a factory. Ultimately, in this case, I had to attach the guard using 2mm thick titanium side plates, which you won't see, but that are hidden by these decorative scales. And these were riveted into the original blade. I ended up concealing the rivets with these aluminium side scales that I ground to look a little bit like stylized Aquila wings to further emphasize the imperial origins of this weapon. Because I used such light materials for the guard, in terms of aluminium and titanium, I ended up only increasing the weapon's overall weight by it's actually less than 50 grams, so hardly at all. And of course, all that weight, all the additional weight, is concentrated here, so it actually doesn't make the weapon handling any worse. Doesn't add weight to the blade. So the other thing that I should mention is this folding wrist strap. I originally incorporated this purely as like an experimental feature that I just wanted to try out, but I liked it so much that I've actually just kept it. It's a semi-flexible looped strap that reinforces the grip. So essentially, it helps to prevent the hand from just being able to release from the hand grip. The hand has to pass this strap in order to fully release. So it makes it a bit harder for the weapon to be lost by the wielder in the chaos of the 41st millennium. If the wielder does not wish to use it, it can be folded up along the side of the guard out of the way. Now, I've decided to leave it fully deployed because it gives the weapon even more of a sort of a sci-fi look and flair. It makes it look quite different. I quite like that. So we come to the sheath carry platform now. The Warhammer 40k wiki defines flak armor as being manufactured from multiple layers of ablative and shock absorbent materials that are primarily ceramic in origin and are intended to deflect and absorb the kinetic energy of a weapon's strike or blow. I think this description usually leads people to erroneously assume that flak armor is very similar to our real-world conventional ballistic protection, because that also incorporates ceramic elements and high-density plastics and the like. However, I would actually challenge this notion, because the language used in the wiki kind of implies that a true systems approach has been applied to the design of flak armor, with multiple layers working together with other layers and components to absorb shock and disperse energy through the process of ablation. Despite the fact that ceramics and high-density plastics are used in our modern-day body armor, most personal body armor systems apply actually a very primitive and simple design methodology. And that amounts simply to put enough high tensile materials in front of the bullet to stop it. Very few ballistic protection options apply a true systems approach to the design, where each of the elements works together to yield an outcome that's more than the sum of its parts. As I mentioned earlier, many Strassids incorporate some form of shielding into the design of the weapon sheath, so that the sheath can be worn in the offhand to augment the wielder's defensive fighting options when fighting in melee. That's indeed the case for this officer's Strassid. So this Strassid sheath carry platform has been designed so that it can be worn in the offhand as a shield of quite reasonable size, actually. And then, of course, combining that with the Strassid gives you the whole sword and board option, which in a way, tactically and strategically, or more tactically I should say, actually compensates for a shorter weapon, compensates for lack of reach. So you can compensate to a certain extent by using the sword and board option. In terms of the Warhammer 40k universe setting, this sheath would have been at least reinforced with flak armor. But since true flak armor has not yet been invented, I could not do that. So while this is not truly flak armor, it's a close practical representation of what it would look like, and it would offer some protection against melee-based attacks. In the case of this Strassid sheath carry platform, I decided that I wanted as much modularity and adaptability as I could build into it. So the outer layer of this sheath is completely covered in a layer of Velcro loop fabric. This just allows for modular packs to be attached, removed, rearranged as desired to suit whatever campaign and environment the Swamp Stalker unit commander is fighting in. I included a blade and edge maintenance kit as well in one of these modular carry platforms, modular carry packs I should say. And this actually includes a sharpening stone to buff out any significant nicks in the blade edge, fine grit sharpening and honing strips to refine the edge, a bottle of Adeptus Mechanicus branded Sacred Silicon and Holy Hydrocarbon Machine Oil, and a bottle of Blessed Triumvirate Tungsten Disulfide Lubricating Unguent. But of course, this couldn't be a Warhammer 40k project without adding some pew pew bling to it. The ducker is strong in the darkness of the 41st millennium. So I decided to add some ammo, as you can see, to the carry platform. In this case, I don't have to build any kind of specialized ammo like bolter shells, for instance, because this officer is not armed with a bolter. But I do have to say that building a real-world functional bolter shell, now that would be a project. I can't imagine a project I can imagine that a project involving a modified 12 gauge shell firing a large gyrojet style slug that ignites after leaving the barrel. I imagine that would be incredibly intricate and difficult to realize, but wouldn't it be bloody cool? So hey, Tau Fledermaus channel, if you're listening, not that you would listen to a tiny channel like this, but can't you get one of your guys to, one of your shotgun slug contributors to design and build a real world functional bolter shell based on a 12 gauge shotgun shell? Make it a thing. Anyway, in any case, my Swamp Stalker unit commander is armed with standard solid projectile weapons, and in particular he is armed with a combat shotgun. I would imagine that he would be carrying standard buckshot and solid slugs in his ammo bag or attached to the shotgun in a shotgun card like this one. However, being a commander, he would also carry some extra special slugs, extra special shells for dealing with particular nasties. And these he might carry on the Strassid carry platform as they are shown here. So I have given him some very rare, high explosive anti-tank shells for any big, heavily armored nasties or vehicles, and some flechette shells for cutting nice wide swathes through a tide of lightly armored critters. So in order to make these, I took some spent 12 gauge shells. These are not active shells. None of the ammunition you see here is active or live. I took some spent 12 gauge shells and I applied some appropriate Adeptus Mechanicus labels, which you can just about see there, to them to bring them in universe. The labels were simply printed on paper, cut out, given a dirty wash, and glued onto the shells and then sprayed with clear lacquer. I also decided to throw in some extra autogun autogun ammo onto one of the modular packs, as you can see. For the autogun ammo, I just hot glued some broken range arrow tips into some spent 308 shells to give them a non-conventional aggressive Warhammer 40K look, as you can see here. Now, being a decorated veteran officer, the Swamp Stalker who owns the Strassid has earned himself some special purity seals, which are on prominent display. The first contains standard imperial litanies to seal the purity and fortitude of the bearer. The second is actually unique to the Strank Swamp Stalkers. It contains their own unique litany, which goes a little bit like this. I am in the pause before the strike. I am in the shiver before the convulsion. I am in the quiet before the detonation. I am in the inhalation before the scream. I am in the moment before death. I am the stalker. Which I think is bloody cool. So I made these purity seals using a specially made stamp onto some polymer clay, which I painted with a dark wash after baking. The litanies, I was going to print them on fabric, as I've done on another project, but I couldn't get that done in time. So instead I opted to print them on standard paper. I then gave them some dirty washes to discolor them and gave them to give them a stained, battle-worn appearance. I then glued them onto some strips of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene unidirectional plastic sheet, sprayed them with a coat of clear lacquer, and then burnt the edges a little bit to give them a worn and singed look. I think the end product actually turned out really good, and I think I'm actually going to do these kinds of purity seals like that from now on. These, as I said, are made out of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene. They're incredibly tough and incredibly durable. The fabric would never be able to outlast these, so I much prefer this. So on to the actual testing. We tested the original cold steel Magnum Kukri Machete, as well as the modified Strassid, using our impulse cut setup and method. I'm not going to go into any details on exactly how that test works, save to point you towards one of my older videos dealing with that subject for you to refer to. This video is already very long, so I'm going to spare you the full presentation of results and conclusions from these tests. But to sum it all up, the unmodified cold steel Magnum Kukri Machete and the Strassid both cut with approximately the same efficiency, which was in the range of 300 to 310 joules per meter. Now this result bummed me out quite a bit, because I had by this time sunk a great deal of time and effort into this project, and I was hoping and expecting a big difference here in terms of results. However, I did notice that the Strassid seemed to cut much deeper than the unmodified Machete. But in those impulse cut tests, we had only performed 2 cutting tests per weapon, which was not enough to confirm that. So I performed a bunch of additional cutting tests, comparing the performance of the unmodified Machete, the Strassid, and actually my full-length combat steel dowel shop, using the same target medium, which in this case was 1 centimeter thick MDF board. I did try to film these cutting tests, but my camera freaked out and I lost the footage. But this is a picture of the MDF board after the test cuts were performed. I've marked out which cuts were performed by the Strassid, the unmodified Machete, and the dowel. As you can hopefully see, the Strassid did indeed cut significantly deeper than the unmodified Machete. In fact, it cut over 1 centimeter deeper on average, which is a very clear difference in performance. It performed so well, in fact, that on average it cut only 0.6 centimeters shallower than the full-length combat steel dowel. This is quite an achievement, that the modified Strassid could cut almost as deeply as a full-length sword. So to cut what is already a very, very long story short, it appears that the various treatments that I applied and the modifications I made to the blade and the edge of the Strassid did indeed improve its performance in terms of cut depth, but did not improve its overall cutting efficiency. All in all, after all my effort, I have been left with what I think is a very attractive Warhammer 40k universe appropriate weapon that actually functions IRL and somewhat like its in-universe fictional counterpart. So I'm happy that it all came together finally and it actually worked, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.